Hello and welcome to another episode of Quick Glance, again on the topic of the Azure Developer CLI. Now, what's new? What's up with the Azure Developer CLI? Well, in September, so a few days ago, there was a new release of the Azure Developer CLI, which lifts now the version to 0.2.0-beta 1. So we have one step up in the minor version, but there are several cool new features and enhancements within the Azure Developer CLI that I shortly want to introduce to you. So first things first, the thing that I guess a lot of folks have been waiting for is the Terraform support. So up to now, you only had the option to use Bicep as infrastructure as code, and there was of course immediately the request to also use Terraform, or to be able to use Terraform. And that was now introduced with this new version. Now, what do you have to do in order to use Terraform? First of all, there are two new samples with Terraform, so you do not have to start from scratch. And you can see here I opened one sample, which is the Node.js Mongo Terraform app, which uses, in contrast to the other samples, Terraform as infrastructure as code. Now, what do you have to do in order to get things going? Well, there is basically one main thing that you have to do, and that's within the azure.yaml file. Within the azure.yaml file, you will now be able to specify the infrastructure provider Terraform, or you will be able to define an infrastructure provider at all. This one is defaulting to Bicep, so nothing to do for you if you are running with Bicep. If you want to use Terraform, you definitely have to add this section here in order to make AZD aware that you are using Terraform. If you want to learn more what's behind that section, and if you want to take a look at what's behind the other sections, I would highly recommend to go to the schema of the YAML language server that's available also in the same repository as the CLI under schemas in the main branch. And there you will see that you have now this new infrastructure section, which is the infrastructure configuration, where you can now specify a provider. And currently you have two options, as we saw before. You also have now two more options that have been enhanced. The path to the location, which contains the provisioning templates. I think that was there in the earlier version too. But what's new is the module one. So you can now also, besides that, be it Bicep or Terraform, define modules or define the location of your provisioning modules, which by default is main. So I think this schema is always worth a look if you are wondering what's going on. Going back to Terraform, so that's what you have to define. And from that point on, you can use Terraform within your infra folder, which defines your resources. Now, there is some more things that you have to keep in mind. And one thing is if you want to use Terraform with a remote state, which you probably want to do when you're using CI/CD. And there is some extended documentation within the Azure Developer CLI, which describes you, first of all the things that I just mentioned are of course mentioned here. I did not invent them. And there's also one big section about the local versus remote state and how to enable that. So there are some steps that you have to do. First one is to, of course, have a remote state storage. And then define within the infra folder a new file, which is not available in the sample, which is the provider.conf.json, where you define basically the location of your storage account via placeholders. And you also have to add the backend section into the provider.tf file in order to make Terraform aware of that. And then in order to fill the placeholders that you have defined within the provider.conf.json, you also have to set the corresponding environment variables via the azd env set command. So that's That's necessary in order to enable the remote state handling with Terraform, and then you're good to go. Now, what I also would like to highlight is, well, if you are starting from scratch and you do not have any bias towards Terraform or towards Bicep, there is a very nice reference here within the announcement blog post that guides you to a section within the Azure documentation or the Microsoft documentation that compares Terraform and Bicep with a lot of aspects that come into play, like infrastructure targets, state handling, processing, authentication, CLI tools, and so on and so forth, which will really help you. If you have already decided within your company you're going for Terraform, I mean, then this is kind of already answered. Now, as I said, there are new templates for the Terraform infrastructure provisioning that you have just seen within the Visual Studio Code. And there is also now the shipping or the official shipping of the C# and Azure SQL template that was available, I think, already quite some time, but I don't think it was part of the official template list. Now that's cool. Then you also have some improvements around the progress reporting when you do an ASET up or an ASET provision, where you can now see, if you take a look here in this area that I'm highlighting, you get the information what resource was created and what's the name. I think that was already there since quite some time, but good to know that there is improvement, and this is really an area where there is continuous improvement. So there is a GitHub issue open for this topic where you can follow up with respect to the UX improvements that should be made or that might come up with the Azure Developer CLI with the ASET up provisioning flow. So if you're interested in that, you can definitely take a look at that and probably also comment or open a discussion if you have something that you would like to see in that flow. Then there are some other minor changes and improvements. So compared to Terraform, of course, that's a huge one. And that's mostly around the VS Code area and some minor improvements in some details of the naming of resources. So let's take a look at that one. And for that, let's open up VS Code. So I have an empty folder here. And what I want to do now is I want to initialize a new Azure Developer CLI application. So I will go for the to-do Node.js Mongo application. As you can see here, all the samples, also the new one with the C# and SQL database, are now consistently fetched from the official list that is available also in the ASET list command, if I'm not mistaken. And if you select one, then, well, things will start here. So you have to add an environment name. You will then, of course, also be questioned which environment you want to use and, of course, which subscription you want to use. After having entered that, what is immediately happening, and that's also new, is that the preview of the README file gets rendered, which should give you an easier entry into the sample and give you a head start. So you do not have, you have 1 click or 2 clicks less to do in order to see what you can do with this sample. Now, there have also been some further improvements that are more in detail. One smaller one is within the main.bicep. The resource that defines the resource group is now named RG and no longer resource group. I think in order to prevent collisions or something like that. And there is also now, when you look at the dev container definition, a language dependency that is considered. So up to now, when you have cloned the sample and initialized it, you might have become aware that within the features section, you saw components that have been dragged into the development container that had nothing to do with your language that you have chosen. So if you had JavaScript or Node based, you also had Python in there, and I think you also had .NET in there. And that's now removed, so you really go with a clean setup with the features that you really need for your setup. And that's, of course, also then reflected in the extension sections. So if you have an older sample, you can compare that, and you will see that those two are different now. As you can see, some versions have not yet been updated, so I think Azure CLI is already at 2.40. I guess that will come with one of the upcoming releases. Now, having said that, that's basically, I think, most of the stuff that was happening around the CLI. Let me shortly check. So we have this README rendering, we have the template list, we have the language-specific definitions of the development containers, we have the renaming of the bicep group, and then we have some further improvements. So bicep outputs are now stored for .NET projects in the .NET user secrets. We have a bug fix around the AZT down command. There is the ---- force option that you can do there, which should then not ask you any questions, which was not the case when you had a key vault in there with secret stores, which threw up a request if it should really be removed, which was due to the fact that there was the soft delete enabled, and that was not handled correctly. That's fixed now, and there is now also support for nested bicep infrastructure modules within Azure Container Apps. If you have been very, very closely looking, you could see that, as I mentioned before, here in the modules way. So you can now really name modules when you provision something, and that's also something that you can see here in the corresponding issue, pull request that was opened up, where you can now define the module where the corresponding service resources are located. And well, then there was also one community contribution for the first time in the AZT CLI. So there was a fix of a bug, which with respect to the output, when something went wrong around logging into GitHub. So that's also fixed now. Yeah, with that, we are through the news of September, and I hope you agree that was already quite some cool stuff that came up here, and I'm looking forward for more stuff to come. And with that, I'd say ABC, always be curious, and see you next time at Quick Glance. Until then, bye.